Hey there, I'm Sam Flegal, and I'm a fantasy artist who does a series of paintings called Fateful Signs, which is all based around my love of Norse mythology. If you want to check that out, you can go to fatefulsigns.com.
Hey guys, I'm Kenny Stewart. I'm a tattooer, and I'm really curious about the Germanic kind of spiritual path. I'm here to talk to Sam about that today.
So me and Kenny have known each other for, years now through Gen-Con, right?
Which is crazy.
Yeah, going back when we went to conventions and not, but
Yeah.
in the before times. We've known each other for years. Done some art for Kenny and his wife, and so we go way back. But recently, Kenny has been reaching out. He's really curious about Norse mythology and some of the spiritual practices around that. And we've been talking for a while. And I was just like, man, I've been curious to do something like this live on the air. Let's do a little live stream and just see what happens. See how this works out. And so what was cracking me up is we were just talking about like what sort of questions he had, what we might cover on today's I want to say show, but I don't even know if this is a show, on today's talk. And we just spent the last minute. You were asking about, should I call it Norse mythology or not? So let's maybe start there. But tell me all the terms you were trying to use.
Well, I've been learning there's a blanket of these. So things like the Indo-European is where it starts, right?
Yep.
So as far as we can tell, is the Indo-European faith, the Germanic. The faith of the Germanic people, or the pre-Christian Germanic faith.
Yep.
The Norse mythology, Nordic, the Scandinavian, basically like that whole chunk before the Christian conversion came through and kind of swept it all up into one or into none, I guess. But yeah, there's just all these paths.
Yeah, no,
that we don't know.
That's all good stuff. So like right off the bat, like I mentioned that I use the term Norse mythology, and even in this video, I called it Kenny Asks About Norse Mythology. And part of the reason that is because when someone's searching on Google, if you put in Germanic mythology or Germanic lore, or you're going to get a whole different set of stuff than people looking to talk about Norse mythology. And so just for Google hits and the right tag words, Norse mythology is more or less the term that we use. But you're also right in thinking that for a lot of people, the term mythology is either offensive or slightly demeaning. I don't feel that way at all, but I know there are people who do feel that way and are perfectly within their rights to feel that way. And I often will use the term Norse lore or Nordic lore. But you're right, like even saying Norse really is specific to, we're talking about like Denmark, Sweden, Norway, and probably Iceland,
Right.
Like all the Nordic people together. But so what's interesting about when you get into like the Germanic heritage, you're actually talking about going all the way from like England, and where the Anglo-Saxons, moved north to settle, all the way over to the Slavic territories where the Rus Vikings settled that area. And that's actually why Russia is called Russia, is the Rus settled that. And so you have this huge swath of similar things. And as modern people, we really like to group all of them together. And to some degree, you can group them all together. They're of similar heritage, similar ancestry. But you also they also had similar gods. Like there's Odin and Wotan and Woden. There's Thor and Thunor and Donner, and they're all a thunder god who has a hammer or an axe, and red hair, and the traits are similar. And Odin kind of varies from being the death god or the god of poetry and kings, but there's always the one eye and a spear and the ravens and those things. And so there are those big cultural similarities, but man, there are also so many nuances where each culture had their own focus. Like a really simple example is that in Germany, or the modern territory that is Germany, Thor was the king of the gods, and he had a crown of stars around the top of his head. I actually did a painting on this called Donner. Thor as Donner is the name of the painting. And so, like, that's just one example. Up in Sweden, you have Freyr, who was considered the high god. And so the reason we think of Odin as being king is because Odin was king of the gods in Denmark, and Denmark settled Iceland. And Iceland is the reason we have any of this stuff preserved, from the two books, the Prose Edda and the Poetic Edda, being the main like source of preserving the poetry of those older cultures. But the specific older culture that was preserved was essentially Danish. But we know, like, the Anglo-Saxons had Wotan and Thunor, but we don't actually know the legends of Woden and Thunor. We know the legends of Odin and Thor at the point in history where those things were recorded down. And so, it all comes together. Look, we got a viewer, Kirk Taskilla's watching. Hey, Kirk, how you doing, man? He's right. Christians often get offended by the use of mythology terminology. And that's the other reason is, the term myth seems to, for some people, mean made up. And they don't like thinking of their spirituality as just being made up, regardless of your faith. So,
right. We focus on, there's like the connotation of myth, exactly what you just said, mythology being made up, instead of like the source of the mythos.
Exactly. Yeah. Which is the stories that some might say bind the universe together, which in that sense, that's a much more positive light. But anyway, I just thought it was funny that, like, before we were going live, we were trying to figure out what to say. And I mean, even on the stream already, I think we've spent the first 7 minutes just talking about how do you speak about this stuff and going down our first rabbit hole, you dig in pretty quickly. So, Kenny, you recently become interested in this stuff. What is it that sparked your interest in, I'm just going to use the term Norse mythos?
Okay, there we go. I like that. Well, it's been in my, I don't know. It's always been in my spheres. Ever since I was a kid, I had a friend that I always went over to their house, and their neighbor was pagan. They had, always had cool stuff in their living room and things like that, statues of Odin, things like that. But recently, I say recently, but really it's been probably for the past 10 years, I've been looking at my spirituality and where I can kind of fit myself. We talked about, like, we as modern humans like to categorize and kind of lump things into like these neat little packages.
Yeah.
I'm wondering what kind of package I can squeeze myself into.
All right.
And really, I started really taking this kind of stuff seriously when I started kind of getting into the 23andMe and Ancestry stuff, and really being out here. So right now I live in New Mexico, and I have tons of native friends, and they are, always talking about colonization and things like that, and talking about the things that they learn in school and how, like, their languages are only passed down by the people who know them. Still, like, they're not taught these kind of things in school. And it got me thinking, like, what about my pre-Christian ancestry? Like, I wonder if there's anything there. And, my last name is Stewart, like I said earlier. So chances are some kind of like Scottish English heritage. Kind of just going down that path and being like, what can I learn about, like, the spiritual beliefs of my ancestors before Christianity like swept it up? Yeah,
absolutely. And of course that is perhaps a lifelong research question, honestly, because there is so much that's been lost. One interesting thing talking about England is that the early English monarchs actually traced their divine right to rule back to being descended from Odin. And if you look at English heritage, even some people who've been connected to English nobility in their like they do the ancestry.com thing. I had a friend who she followed her lineage all the way back. Her mom did. And it got to the end and said, you're descended from this king who is descended from Odin. And next time I saw her at like a Christmas party or something, she was like, by the way, Sam, I think you get a kick out of this. I'm descended from Odin.
That's right. She's Odin's daughter.
Exactly. And in Ontario, though, what I think is so cool is there are tons of legends about the gods coming down and mingling with people. That's a part of a lot of different pagan religions, but it's very present. There's even a set of poetry called Rigg's poems, which is about Rig, who many people say are Heimdall. There's some pretty interesting debate about Rig being actually Odin. I don't think is worth getting into just right this second. But regardless, Rig was a god who came in, and the poem is all about, he teaches the poor what their role in society is. He teaches the middle class and the warrior what their role is, and he teaches the king what their role is. But in each section of the poem, Rig is impregnating and having children that are in all levels of society.
Right. He has like the daughter with the slave class or named slave, right? And then freeman, and then what's the upper tier?
That'd be Drayton, I think, or Jarl.
Yeah, something like that. Yeah. But yeah, totally. And that's something that I love about these pre-Christian ideas a lot of times, is the fact that these gods aren't, they're not necessarily, like, obviously they exist on like a different plane, but they're more archetypes and symbols of humanity, and where we can get people to, I don't know how to say this, but it's comforting thinking that like, oh, like I know this story about this all-powerful being who has the same kind of personality flaws.
Sure.
So just being able to relate, I think is incredibly powerful, and something that, most modern day religions, you don't really get to do that. You might get to relate to like Jesus in some way like that, but not without like, a huge chunk of his life is omitted.
There's that. It's also for me when I was certainly raised Christian and taught the stories of the Bible, and the stories they're about deserts and about parts of the world that don't really make a lot of sense to me, and cultures that are somewhat lost on me. But when you read about Thor and Loki and Odin wandering through the woods with snow and eagles and wolves and ravens and bears and giants, like those are so evocative. And for me, like that gets my blood pumping, that gets me excited. And I feel like I'm there. Some of that I think is because like there is the lineage, like you and I are both gamers. We talked about meeting at Gen Con, love of Dungeons and Dragons, which for me also goes back to a love of The Hobbit and The Lord of the Rings. And when you really dig in on Tolkien, you realize he was just steeped in the lore of Norse mythos, Norse mythology.
All right.
Even, I don't know if you saw the movie that came out last year, but when Tolkien came out, they showed in the thing that Tolkien's mother actually read him the Volsung saga, which is the saga of Siegfried and his battle with the dragon Fafnir. And one of the big parts of that story is that in that story, like Siegfried hides under the ground and he jumps up and he stabs the dragon in, as legend has it, a single hole in his scales, the one place he's vulnerable, obviously Smaug, right?
Yeah.
And then as the dragon is dying, Siegfried and Fafnir have this conversation where Fafnir refers to Siegfried by other names that are poetically invoking, and they have this very long poetic back and forth conversation, and you just see basically Tolkien just rearranged that and put that conversation where Bilbo's in there saying, I'm the barrel rider, and
the ring bearer and all that,
walks unseen, and all those things, and the dragon being this not just a monster, but this creature you could have a conversation with. That goes right back to Siegfried's tale, which goes back to Wagner and the ring cycle, and the importance of the ring. Even other symbols in there is Odin has Draupnir, which is a ring that every 9 days drops 9 rings from the master ring, which is Odin's ring. And the reason that legend was so appealing to the Vikings is, in order to be a good chieftain, in order to be a good king, you needed to be able to share your wealth with other people. And so the idea of a king who every 9 days has 9 new rings to give out to his thanes and to his housecarls and to his warriors would be the ultimate ruler, because it would never run out. But then you think of Lord of the Rings and you're like, oh man, the master ring that drops 9 rings and like everything there. And obviously Tolkien did what every great artist does, which is he took his inspirations and he made it something so much more. He made it his own. But for me, like, that's where like a lot of the questions you're asking, and the reason this stuff resonates, is this stuff has been in at least my blood and in our core, not just for my lifetime, but for hundreds of thousands of years, going back to that pre-Christian time, to the point where even the Christianization of those countries didn't totally remove all of the practices. I mean, there's still elves are referenced in Iceland, and the Tomten or the Nissen, which are the gnomes that are referenced throughout. Yeah, Kirk's adding in the Finnish as well. Absolutely. And you have the Sami tribes from Finland, which where a lot of the magical practices came from, and a lot of that was preserved even longer. Anyway, we could get into all that, but we've done a hell of an intro here. We managed to talk 17 minutes. You have to ask your first question, so let's get to some of these questions you got, Kenny.
Yeah, I do have a handful of questions here for you, Sam. So the first one is, wait. The first one, the biggest one, I think, is like, what does being a heathen mean to you?
So I feel like in order to answer that question, we got to talk about the term heathen. And so that gets used a lot these days to mean 2 things. Two groups have actually latched on to the term heathen. And the first, I call my group heathen with a big H, but maybe the other group would disagree, is, people who have incorporated some of the Germanic spirituality into their personal and perhaps even social or group spiritual practice. But then there's also atheists refer to themselves as heathens as well. And I call that heathen with a little h. And that's because of all the lines in the Bible where it refers to the heathen as being undesirable. And so atheists, kind of adopt that, we're dirty heathens because we don't believe in God. And so where does that term go back to is actually that when the North was Christianized, it was largely because the Catholic Church was the largest economic power in Europe at the time. They were also the primary arms dealer. So if you wanted good trade in steel and weapons and armor, you had to in some way be involved with the Catholic Church. But just in general, other countries would not trade with you if you were not a Catholic nation. So as the northern countries were becoming more and more based around medieval king, the rulership of nobility and serfs, and basically adopting the lifestyles of their neighbors, it became clear, regardless of the spiritual implications, but that the social and political implications meant the nobles understood that they needed to be Christian. And so the nobles became Christian first. And as the kings and other nobility became Christian, and there's lots and lots of stories about how they converted people. And in some cases, I forget the name of the king, but there's a king who would have these hot pokers, and they'd tear out your tongue with a hot poker if you said you were pagan and, rip it out. But if you said you were Christian, you're fine. So obviously lots of people are saying, even some of the records we have, or the archaeological evidence we have at the time, is there's several jeweler kits that in one side they have a Thor's hammer, and in the other side they had a cross. So a silversmith could just pour the metal in whichever side you wanted, close it, and stamp out your particular thing. That's another thing a lot of people realize is the Thor's hammer was definitely a symbol, which I'm actually wearing one here. It looks like an anchor to a lot of people. But the Thor's hammer was a symbol that goes back far, but it didn't become prevalent until they encountered Christianity, and people felt the need to wear it and like show their separation, from something else. And that time in history is called Red Thor versus White Christ, is what they'd write about it. And red was considered a man's color. So it was like, you are, red, you're mighty, you're strong, Thor's red beard. Whereas white was actually considered a coward's color, which is to say, like now we'd say someone was yellow. I always think of, like Back to the Future.
Yeah.
Yellow. And so that was the idea to say cowardly Christ, or someone who would live a life of peace and set down their arms, that sort of thing. And so anyways, as this social time developed, heath was the term for the farmland. And so heathen would be the people who lived there. And so the farmers did not see any need to convert and wouldn't have encountered, the people living in rural America have very different lifestyles than those living in the city now, right? Like this is just as true today. And it was probably even more true back then because information traveled even more slowly. And so we don't know for sure if this was a real term. This is one of the big theories. There's actually a great deal of debate about where heathen comes from and what heathen means. But anyway, the where it comes into use in the English language is to refer to these rural people. And so it's not unlike our modern term redneck, where you'd or hillbilly is another term, for people who, like in Kentucky, you'll hear the term hillbilly a lot, or bluegrass music, like all that kind of stuff. It's just referring to rural people who have a different way of life. And back then, though, that division was the Christian, noble, and city people versus the rural, pagan, traditional people that were still out there. And so that's where that term gets used. And so modern pagans who follow the Germanic tradition like the term heathen, because pagan is a Latin word. It's a Latin root. And it goes back to a similar time when the Romans were having to deal with people who wanted to keep the old ways rather than adopt the Catholic Church at that time. Similar word. That's why the words are interchangeable. But heathen, it's an Old Norse word, and so it's a Germanic word. And so for a Germanic faith, they adopt the term heathen for that reason. So when you ask, like, what does heathen mean? I think at a base level, we need to talk about, where does it come from? What does that mean?
Right. That's super good information and 100% makes sense. You know what I'm saying? Like when you're talking about the seeking, like I am, or like maybe a lot of people are these days, about trying to find those like pre-Christian roots. Like why go for the word that's, you know what I'm saying? That's like not rooted.
Absolutely.
In your target.
And so then, like, to elaborate on that, like, what does it mean? It can mean many different things to many different people. Another term you'll hear thrown around a lot is asatru or asatru, which is true, TRU, is the word, I mean, like truth or the faith. And then asa is a shortened form of the Aesir. Like you'll sometimes see, let's say Asa Thor, or they refer to Heimdall as the whitest ace, which is a lot of people read as ass, but there's just our modern language. And so it's saying the truth or faith in the Aesir, which is the group of gods that Odin follows. And so asatru is the term that was used, or asatru is how I think it's said. That was the term throughout 70s, 80s, and 90s. And it was really only in the early 2000s you started to see heathen become more. And I would say it was probably 2010 to 2015 where it switched, because asatru has become a really big thing in Iceland and refers more specifically to the Icelandic movement in asatru And so there's also other groups in America that believe that they founded that term, and it did happen at a very close time in the 70s. And, it gets into that. And so, but heathen is the catch-all term because there are heathens who follow the Old English gods using the terms like, Thunor and Woden instead of Odin and Thor, or instead of Frigg or Freya, they'd say Frige. And they, when looking at their heritage is English. And so they use the English terminology in those ways. There's other groups who focus, I know there's some that focus specifically on modern, the what is now modern Germany, where they do have Donner as king, and they use that terminology for their spirituality. And so there's so many different groups and different ways. But the one similar thing they have is this connected web of the Germanic myths. And so that's where heathen comes from. And it can mean so many different things. And as you do this longer and you meet other heathens, I wouldn't say the first conversation you have, but pretty soon into getting to know another heathen will be, so what's your flavor of all this? Like what is it that you like and you do? And for some people like myself, it's more of a private practice where it's just me and my family. I do have a few close friends that I will do rituals with sometimes, but then there's other groups that are more, they do have huge, they call them kindreds, which is, like a word for brother and sisterhood. And instead of like the normal pagan word is coven, you'll hear that like witches coven, whereas the heathens have their kindreds. And, some of those kindreds get up to 50 or 60 people. I think it's more common for them to be around 8 to 10 people. And they're a close-knit group of people that have a spiritual practice together. And, there's certain ways that they worship. There are certain hallmarks of being heathen. But there's also a great deal of debate about, what makes a good heathen. And you'll hear so often a term that always makes me roll my eye, but the whole "you're doing it wrong" thing. People feel like it's not just enough that they've found their own personal spiritual practice, but they've found a spiritual practice that is therefore correct for everyone. And, people like to argue on the internet, and, Asatru and heathenry is no different in that.
Right. So we've learned that if we're going to talk about being a heathen, we've got to talk about where the term comes from, as opposed to being a heathen, as opposed to a pagan.
Yeah.
And connecting to that Germanic root, which is kind of spread all throughout all of these different, I guess, sub-factions would be my D&D, like
yep.
my tabletop gaming way to say that.
Yeah.
Sub-factions, I guess, or sects. There we go. SECTS. Okay. So we talked about that. We talked about a lot of things. We talked about either practicing heathenism as you do by yourself, or joining not a coven, but a kindred of a community of heathens, all practicing similar, practicing their faith similarly, I guess I would say. So that brings me to my next question, is that like how, or what are some of the common ways that heathens honor the gods or their ancestors?
So, I think the first thing is that for most heathens these days, your ancestors are considered to play a higher spiritual role in your life than the gods and goddesses do. And the best picture I've seen for this is the idea that gods and goddesses are big picture, big concepts, but your personal luck is tied directly to the actions of your ancestors. And so even in the afterlife, they continue to look after the luck of the living descendants that still tend the family luck. There's so much deeper information on all of that in terms of like terms like weird and, your personal luck, and it can go very deep into all the terminology, which I don't think we would want to start there. But so I think that's the big thing, is that ancestor I don't even like the term ancestor worship. I prefer the term ancestor veneration. Because whether or not you believe that your ancestors like go on to become minor gods or goddesses, I think we all can accept the idea that we are who we are because of the choices of those who came before us and the choices we've made in our own life. But in order to honor our own choices, I think we need to honor those that came before. And the other thing I think is really interesting about ancestor veneration is when you look at every tribal and native folkway across the entire world, ancestor veneration is one of the most common threads that they share. And you get into there's a lot of writing about how what's really the difference between Jupiter and Zeus and Thor, and other thunder gods from other cultures, and they start to look at the similarities, and that's something that you see a lot. But and I do think some of that's interesting and speaks to humanity. But when you look at even like Japanese Shinto belief, there's lots of similarities. They believe in animism. They believe in spirits inside of trees and nature, but they also have a lot of ancestor veneration. Even Buddhism has a lot of ancestor veneration. African tribal beliefs, ancestor veneration. And there's just something about us as people, whether or not it's true doesn't actually matter to me. What I think is far more interesting is there is a peace that comes with knowing where you came from and honoring those people. And so you asked me earlier, like, what are some of my personal heathen practices? And I'll share one of them now, which is that I do keep a shelf at home where I keep pictures of both mine and my wife's relatives who've passed on, those that are dead that we believe look down on us. And whether or not they do look on us, we at least look back to them in times. And we typically take some time with my daughter to honor them during times like Yule or other times when we're having a big gathering, sometimes at New Year's. And part of how you honor, and this is also where you look at connection again, all the different faiths do a similar thing, which is they typically leave out food or libation in honor of this invisible, unseen force in their lives. Like I was actually eating at a Thai restaurant locally, and as I was leaving the Thai restaurant, I noticed in the corner of their restaurant, almost out of the way, they had a little statue of the Buddha, but then down in front of that, they had a series of smaller statues, which I don't know what they were. And then they had a couple of buns, some incense, and some, it looked like alcohol. It could have been water that was left in bowls and cups out for that. And that's the same sort of thing you see the Shinto leave food, or even the modern practice of why would we leave flowers at a grave to someone who can't see or benefit the flowers, right? It's because we're honoring the dead. It's their memory. And so those sorts of things, if you were going to do anything with heathenry, I know the gods are sexy, but really digging into your own ancestors and the people important to your life are, in my opinion, so much more important than worrying about the gods and the goddesses, even though, man, that stuff is juicy and fun.
Right. Well, I know before we hopped on live, we were talking about, I mentioned that I was a tattooer, not a tattoo artist.
Yeah.
And it had to do with like honoring the tradition of American tattooing, and going down that path. And similarly, looking back on where you come from, and which is exactly what led me down the path to being on this video with you today, is looking back on where I came from, looking back on who my ancestors were, and what they did and what they believed. And I think what you said resonated very deeply with me, is that it doesn't matter if they are looking down on us or not. What matters is that we are remembering them and acknowledging them, because same thing with flowers. Funerals are for the living,
right? Yeah, and there really is a peace that comes with meditating on these things. And so then the other piece of like common practices are, yes, veneration. Usually when large groups of heathens gather together, that's when the gods and goddesses are mentioned. Although There are also times when at certain times of year in your home, you might leave out libation to a specific god or goddess. Then another is the term bloat, B-L-O-T, which is the Old Norse word for blood. And what's interesting is, like, before a meal, a prominent member of the community, usually a woman, would take a bowl and fill it with the blood that had been drained from the animal that was being served. And then she would dip a sprig of whatever the appropriate foliage was for the season, some sort of leaf. And then each person would get a little dab of blood, usually right on their forehead or on their person in some way. And they called this passing out the bloat sing, which in modern English is the cognate for blessing.
Right.
So you had the blessing before the meal, the bloat sing. But bloat also refers to the sacrifice of an animal, and that specifically should not be viewed like a lot of people hear animal sacrifice and they're like, whoa, I saw that crazy episode about Satanism. And, it's like, no. All it was, even the early Jews practiced the same thing, which is that when you kill an animal, you ritualistically kill it. You offer its organs that are unedible to the gods by placing it in the fire. You preserve the blood. You use every aspect of the animal that is usable, and sometimes reserve the finer cuts of meat, some amount, to be placed on an ancestral altar to offer to them as well. And so we say animal sacrifice, but it's really just preparing an animal for a feast in a ritualistic, spiritual fashion, where we acknowledge that the death of this animal both nourishes us, nourishes the community, and nourishes spirituality, which is something that I think most modern people still get. It's just we hear that word sacrifice and people are like, no, cultist, Cthulhu,
Well, yeah, the connotations with sacrifice. It's the same thing like we were talking earlier, the connotations of heathen, or the connotations of, what was it? It may have even been before we were
but
live.
There's tons of words like that. But the thing I know about bloat in modern heathenry does not always refer to the death of an animal. Now, some groups believe it should only refer to if the group is ritualistically sacrificing an animal for food. But it also just refers to a large gathering where a blessing is going to be left out for, usually it's just libation, or they'll take, like if there's a big feast, like a potluck, someone prominent in the community will go through and take a piece of all the food and make sure that a portion goes to the gods and a portion goes to the ancestors. And then there's libation that everyone drinks from and is also poured out. And that is called a bloat. And there's lots of, just like we get into the nuances, there's so many different nuances that are all over the place, but those are some of the common things you'll hear among modern heathens, and how they practice their spirituality within community and within their home.
Okay. So I guess this is an immediate question coming off of that is, so I'll leave a little bit of food out for the ancestors. At what point do I throw it away?
That's a great question. One thing I think is interesting is like in Denmark, they still leave out a bowl of milk at Christmas time or at Yule for the elves or for the tomten.
Yeah.
And there's an old story where we know much about the Rus, which is what the 13th warrior is based on, is the writings of Ibn Fahlan. And he talks about seeing the Rus do what we presume is a bloat and leave food out. And a dog came and ate the food. And the Vikings, the Rus, all thought that this was a sign that the gods had accepted their offering. So that would be the first thing I would say, is that you should have a garden or a place outside. If you live near the woods, go out into the woods a while. And so if you want to leave the plate or the libation in your house in a sacred place, then after about a day or whatever feels comfortable to you, then you can grab a hold of that you would take it out into the backyard, set it someplace where it can decompose. Maybe you have a compost pile. but pour it into a garden. And if a cat comes along and gets a meal or whatever, just know that the gods have heard what it is that you're doing. There's a comment by wow, Vlad Tepes is watching. That's pretty impressive. He's saying modern paganism is a mere shadow of ancient practices, trying to literally recreate old ways would land you in prison so fast your head would spin. Yes, ritualistically sacrificing goats or chickens, especially if you're in a city, is probably not the best way. But I do know of heathens that own their own farms and they slaughter animals regularly, and they do perform the bloat in a way that is both honorable and legal and good for the animal. Because if the animal suffers at all, that's considered to be a bad sign of the ritual as well. But anyway, thanks for watching, Dracula. We appreciate your comment. But it is a good point, and that's the reason why when I say bloat, it can refer to so many different things, because as modern people, we have to accept that it's not 1,000 years ago. Part of heathenry, I think, is the romanticized version of the Viking times, and that's very appealing. But we do have to remember that this is a modern times and modern practices and a modern faith, even though we acknowledge where we came from. We've been talking like 40 minutes. Do you have any other final questions? I feel like we should wrap this thing up.
Yeah. Okay. So well, I've got a lot of questions, definitely.
Well, maybe we could do this again sometime.
Yeah, that would be great. But my last one would be, if you have any recommendations on further reading of the historical side of the heathen faith, or even not even faith, but just like how the heathens lived. I know I go a lot to Dr. Jackson Crawford on YouTube for Dr. Cowboy Viking for his stuff. But what do you recommend? What do you read? What do you watch?
As far as YouTubers go, in addition to Jackson Crawford, I highly recommend Mattias Nordvig, who is a professor of Scandinavian pre-Christian studies at the University of Colorado. And I did an interview with him about the section on Balder. I did a whole interview with him about the god Balder and his death, and you can watch that anytime. It's like an hour-long conversation, and I highly recommend that. And all the links for Mattias are there. But his YouTube channel, he gets into like Viking Age shamanism and what was true and what probably wasn't true, and he is so knowledgeable it makes my head spin. Like I'm an artist and I'm into all this stuff, but that dude is a scholar, and my hat off to him. I love talking with him. Then as far as books, like obviously the prose Edda and the poetic Edda are the place to start, but they really are just the beginnings of things. I really like H.R. Ellis Davidson wrote a book called The Gods and Myths of Northern Europe. She also has an interesting book called Myths and Symbolism in Pagan Europe, where she compares the Celtic gods to the Norse gods and the intermingling of those things. Then Lars Magnar Enoksen. I'm so bad at saying his name. Enoksen. He wrote The History of Runic Lore, but Lars is a Scandinavian scholar, and he does a wonderful section on. His book is super thin, but it contains all the information we actually know on the runes. But he's done other books on pagan practices, and the way he's determined the pagan practices is he examined Scandinavian sermons from around the Christian time, early conversion times, and basically all the stuff the minister is saying, don't do these things because these are heathen. He goes through and reverse engineers them, and basically says, like, if a priest is telling someone not to do it, it was probably because people were doing it. And so that book's also available but you have to order direct from Lars's website. And yeah, I highly recommend his stuff. And then, for people interested specifically in heathenry and not just kind of Norse mythology and the history, I recommend Our Troth, the second edition, both volume 1 and 2. That's Troth, Troth. And those books, they go deep into the history, the modern practice, And anyway, there's a lot of stuff there. So I think those would all be good resources. I often hear the joke thrown around among heathens that this is a religion with homework. And that's appealing to some and not appealing to others. But for me, that's, I think, what led me to this spiritual path is more my voracious interest in the history and the lore and the scholarship around it. Not so much that I want to be an archaeologist, but I actually enjoy reading dissertations by people. And anyway, I think there's way more books than that. I could go on. In fact, I have a thing on my website, the top 10 books for Norse mythology. And if I'm smart, I'll throw that in the links below. But anyway, oh yeah, Kurt Teskill is saying, what about my books? Thanks, Kurt. I appreciate you throwing that out there. I've done a illustrated version of the Völuspá and the Hávamál, both of which are from the Poetic Edda. Völuspá is technically book 1, and the Hávamál is book 2 of the Poetic Edda. And my books contain an English translation done in 1923 with notes from the translator, side by side with the original Old Norse, so you can compare them. And then I did drawings based on meditations I did on those old lore. So the Hávamál is the Wisdom of Odin. It's the sayings of the High One. It's essentially Viking life advice. And the Völuspá is the prophecy of the Volva, who is the prophet who told all about Ragnarok. Odin goes to visit her, and first she tells him all these secrets of the past, and then she tells Odin secrets only he's supposed to know, and he's so impressed that he says, now tell me the future, and then she talks about everyone dying and all of the murder and cold and terror, classic stuff. So anyways, there you go.
Yeah, man, those recommendations, I would love it if we could get a link to those.
Yeah, I'll at the very least, I'll throw a link to my top 10 list. I'll put down below because
there you go.
I've got that for sure. I mean, King, thank you so much for your questions, man. I would never have been able to talk about this stuff had I not had your interest and your prompts. So I'm excited to see where this goes.
Yeah, well, I'm happy to do it again whenever you need.
All right. Cool, man. Well, guys, thank you. The few people who did catch this live, we didn't really post much about it, but I appreciate you guys being there. And if you're watching this later, thank you so much. And if you happen to think about it, maybe like and subscribe. That would be cool. All right, later on.